Okay, let's talk about hypertrophy. What are the ways that people can induce hypertrophy?
Hypertrophy has a very broad range in terms of your actual applications. And this is why you have and will continue to see countless styles of training that all work. If you've ever thought to yourself, like, why is it all these programs work? Well, that's because what's driving changes in strength and power are the adaptations of specificity. What's driving changes in hypertrophy is much more well-rounded. And so you have options to get there. Remember, you're training a movement, and now you're training a response in a muscle that causes the growth. That's very, very different. So if we look at like the classic dogma, we have to basically challenge the muscle to need to come back, in this case, specifically bigger, and the nutrients need to be there to support that growth. So all we really have to do is, going back to our dogma of activation of something on the cell wall, that's got to induce that signaling cascade. That's got to be strong enough to cause the nucleus to react to it, to go to the ribosomes, to initiate this entire cascade of protein synthesis. Okay, so that signal has to be one of a couple of things. Either it has to be strong enough one time, it has to be frequent enough, or it has to be a combination of these things. I can get there with a lot of frequency and a moderate signal. I can get there with very low frequency and a large signal. What you have to do there to not fail is to make sure the training is hard enough. If you choose the frequency path, then you actually have to make sure you're not training too hard to where you can actually maintain the frequency. The only wrong combination here is infrequent and low intensity and low volume. That's it. As long as one of those three variables is high, you're going to get there, because the mechanisms that are needed to activate that signaling cascade are wide-ranging. And this is why when we even see things like blood flow restriction training, right? This is when you put like a cuff on your arm or your leg and you block blood flow and you use no load, or as low as, say, 30% of your maximum, and you take it to fatigue failure. That actually is an equally effective way of inducing hypertrophy, despite the fact that, you're using 3, 5, 10, maybe most 20 to 30% of your 1 rep max. Why? Because you went through the route of metabolic disturbance. Okay. Other ways, say a higher load, maybe as heavy as you can for, say, 8 repetitions, is going to get through what's called mechanical tension. And so there's these different paths that we can get to the same spot. Now, eventually, these things have a saturation point. So you don't need all 3 of these mechanisms. The third one, of course, being muscle damage. Fairly simple when it comes to hypertrophy. You just have to make sure you do the work. And in terms of application, what numbers to hit, we can go through each one of our modifiable variables and walk through some of our best practices in each category.
So I'd love to talk about those modifiable variables as they relate to choice, order of movements, volume, so sets and repetitions, and frequency of training. So would love to go through this list one by one, starting with exercise choice.
I would actually generally encourage people to choose exercises in a variety of fashions. I actually think that it's important that you do some number of combination of what we call bilateral and unilateral exercises. Lateral being, think about it like a squat, where bi meaning 2, lateral, you have 2 feet on the ground moving in sequence here. Unilateral is 1. So this could be something as simple as a rear foot elevated split squat. It could be a single leg press or single leg curl. It could be a pistol squat, something where the individual limb is moving one at a time. You need to have a combination of bilateral and unilateral training. That's good to do for strength as well. Also very important for making sure, for hypertrophy's sake, you're not getting any imbalances as you progress, especially through months and years of training. So make sure you're doing a little bit of a combination. So when you're choosing exercises for hypertrophy, you're going to want to start with those bigger compound movements. That's going to be drive a lot of the adaptation. You can get to these single joint movements like a little bit later. But having said that, because of the way that people move differently, their anthropometrics and their biomechanics and even their technique, the same exact exercise will not necessarily work the same exact muscle groups for multiple people. It's very important that you're actually seeing progress there. And don't worry about, well, in the textbook, the bench press is supposed to be good for your pec. Because if you're not actually moving the right position, or it depends on the angle in which your sternum actually sits in your body, a bench press may actually be doing very little for your pec, and you may need to adjust to, say, an incline bench or a decline bench or a pec fly. So machines can be fantastic at letting you isolate without having to worry about things like stability, your low back position, getting hurt, where's your neck at. You can really concentrate on just the movement, concentrate on the muscle, and let everything else kind of go away and ensure you're getting training in that specific area.
Those are excellent recommendations. What about exercise order?
Amazing. So implicit in this exercise choice thing, it's what you're going to notice is these modifiable variables interact with each other, right? And you can clearly see how when we talked about volume, and to clarify, volume is the repetitions multiplied by the sets. That's typically how we express volume. Well, that's going to be directly influenced by intensity. The heavier load you put on the barbell, the less repetitions you can do. And the inverse, right? Rest intervals. The shorter you keep your rest intervals, then either the lower the weight has to go, the intensity, or the lower the rep range has to go. Order is the same thing. Choice is the same thing. So all of these things modify each other. They play a little bit of a hand in what everything else does. So with the exercise choice thing, rolling into exercise order, you get to play a couple of games here. You can do the thing you're just simply most interested in first. You can do this thing called pre-fatigue. So say you're going to do a back day. You could go in and do nothing but isolated biceps as your very first exercise and then roll into your pulling movements, because what you'll see is during most pulling activities, the biceps are a secondary or tertiary muscle group. But you've pre-fatigued them. You've guaranteed that muscle of most interest got its most training in, and everything else is secondary. So you can start, if you want, with single joint movements. You can start with isolation stuff, or you can start with compound stuff. Either way, it just really comes down to preference and what you're specifically trying to develop.
Let's talk volume.
Yep.
How much volume does each muscle group need per week in order to generate, and for that matter, maintain hypertrophy?
Right. So the kind of minimum number we're going to look for here is 10 working sets.
Per week?
Correct.
Per muscle group?
Correct.
If I do a chin-up or a pull-up, I'm going to mainly be training my back muscles, my lats, but there'll be indirect targeting of the biceps. So how does one meet this 10 sets per week minimum when dividing different body parts and thinking about this direct and indirect activation?
Right. So two things. There's no specific exact rule here. And this is why these set ranges are ranges, right? And this is why we don't say like 10 is. So 10 would be sort of the minimum number you want to get to. The more realistic number that most people, especially if you're advanced or even intermediate, is more like 15 to 20 working sets per week. 10 was just sort of that like absolute minimum number to maintain, which is actually pretty cool if you think about it this way. If you went in and you did 3 sets of 10, it's a very standard
3 sets of
protocol.
10 repetitions.
Correct. Yeah. You're already at 3. You did that 3 days a week. You're at your 9. That's almost 10. If you also just went to the gym 1 day a week, you did 3 sets of 10, and you did 3 exercises, you're at 9 working sets. You're basically done. So achieving 10 sets per week per muscle group, and now we're not even talking about indirect activation of a secondary. So you're going to hit 10 fairly easy. Extension of that, hitting 20 is actually still not that hard because of what's actually going to happen there. So in your example, if you're doing your chin-ups, well, would the biceps count? There's no exact rule there because there could be technique issues. It could be hand position. So you mentioned chin-up very specifically. A chin-up is actually going to put your hands in this position where your palms are facing up, right? This is supination and pronation. So you're going to be there. But chin-up actually is going to be pretty good activator of your biceps for most people. So you would expect actually to probably count that.
You've established that 10 really to 20 sets per week is the kind of bounds for maintaining and initiating hypertrophy.
Yep. If I were to like flag one of them, I would say 15 to 20 is the sets that you want to get working. Now, it gets complicated when you ask, well, how many reps per set do I have to get to? Okay, well, we also can complicate that by repetition type and tempo. Just sort of let all that go for now and just think if you're getting close to that range, you're in the spot. And all you have to do now is balance 2 things, recovery and continued training. Okay, so if you're somewhere in this 10 to 20 working sets range and you're in a position where you can continue to do that, you're not so sore and so damaged and beat up that you can't maintain that volume for 8 weeks at a time or at least 6 weeks at a time, then I'd probably say either the style of repetitions, the amount of repetitions per set you're doing are too much. The volume is getting to you. However, if you're not seeing adaptations, then I'd say maybe the repetitions aren't enough. And so that's the kind of game you're running. Now, there could be plenty of other factors.
Intensity.
Of course. Yeah, intensity, intent, and then of course the other things: sleep, nutrition, etc. All these other things that go into our visible stressor category that we always analyze.
So we've talked about exercise choice, and we've talked about the number of sets that one needs in order to induce hypertrophy per week. What about repetition ranges? You've mentioned pretty broad repetition ranges. How many repetitions per set is required in order to induce hypertrophy?
Yep. So there are two caveats here before I give you, well, the number is somewhere between like 4 to 30 reps.
30 repetitions.
Absolutely. In fact, I think you can go much higher.
The first 20 have to feel exceedingly light.
Correct.
And during those first 20 or so repetitions, is the goal still to contract the muscle as hard as possible on each repetition?
So this is the caveat. Caveat number 1 is there is an assumption that by the end of this set, you're getting somewhat close to failure. So you don't have to go to absolute failure to induce muscle hypertrophy, but you also have to get kind of close. If you're going to do a set of 25 and you finish it and you're like, ooh, yeah, like that was kind of starting to get hard at the end, that's not going to be enough. If you're going to do a set of 5 or 6 and the same sort of expression comes out of your mouth, it's not going to be enough. So in that case, it doesn't matter your rep range if you're not getting somewhat close to failure. Again, it doesn't need to be complete failure. A good number to think about is like -2, which is what we call reps in reserve, which is sort of like I got within 2 or so reps of failure and then I stopped.
And can we define failure, at least for sake of this portion of the conversation, as the point at which you can no longer move the resistance anymore in the concentric phase of the exercise movement in good form?
Correct. That's a really nice momentary muscular failure is how we typically define it. There's a wonderful review, I think it's open access, that just came out in the last handful of months. Eric Helms' team out of New Zealand. Eric is a great scientist and a very experienced physique coach and a competitor himself. So he knows a lot about this area. What they basically showed is going all the way to failure in the defining failure like you just did. Failure is still needed in caveat 2, which is, again, very, very highly trained individuals. You won't see people who are like Eric or other folks who are 6 to 8 to 10 years into very serious training who don't have to go to failure probably a little bit more than what I just said. So the layout that they brought in their paper was very nice, and they basically said, okay, here's a couple of scenarios in which going to failure is maybe the best way to do it. Number 1, you probably should do it on a little bit of the safer exercises. So maybe taking your back squat on a barbell to complete failure and doing that as like a standard protocol multiple times a week, it's maybe not the best choice. So maybe if you're going to do barbell back squats, you take that to your 1 or 2 reps in reserve, stop there. It's a lot of work. You're going to take that failure to maybe the hack squat machine, or maybe even to the leg extension machine. So a little bit of a safer exercise. They also can tend to be single joint exercises, don't have to be, but they're just ones that are not as complicated and you're not likely to injure other body parts when you're doing it, all right? Another way to go about it is simply doing it on like the last movement of the day, right? And so again, you're not gonna do it on your first 3 or 4 exercises, but whatever your last finisher is, you'll hit total failure on that one. And that kind of keeps you in a range of, yeah, you hit some failure, you got a lot of overall work done, so that's a lot of stimulus, that's a lot of noise going to that nucleus that says grow, 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 but you didn't totally obliterate yourself.
What about rest between sets?
Great. This is the interplay now. So one actually thing we said for a long time is you want to stick between 30 to 90 seconds of rest between sets for hypertrophy. More recent research, a lot of this out of Brad Schoenfeld's lab and others have shown that that's just doesn't seem to be the case. You can take up to 3 to 5 minutes of rest in between sets and be fine. The caveat here, though, is this. If you're going to rest longer, that means the metabolic challenge is lower. So you need to then increase the challenge in either mechanical tension, which think about as weight, load, or muscle breakdown. So you can't lower one of the variables, keep everything else the same, and expect the same result. So if you're going to have more rest, then you need to either preserve the load on your bar or the volume. One of the two has to happen. So this gives people a lot of opportunity. I generally tell people, if you're going to train for hypertrophy, it's probably best to stay in the 2-minute range at most. You can go longer, but a lot of people have a hard time actually coming back and then executing that next set with enough intent to get there, and or it's going to make your workouts tremendously long.
3 exercises per muscle group. First exercise, slightly heavier loads. So repetition ranges somewhere between, let's say, 5 and 8, with perhaps hitting failure or close to it on the last set. Rest periods of somewhere between 2, or let's get wild and say 5 minutes.
Sure.
Okay, so it's a little bit more of a strength type workout at that point. But then moving to a second exercise of 3 or 4 sets, where the repetition range is now 8 to 15, shortening the rest periods to 90 seconds or so. And then on the third exercise, repetition ranges of 12 to 30, very short rest intervals, maybe 30 seconds between sets. Would that allow somebody to target all 3 forms of major adaptation? That better than to, for instance, do all the high repetition work in one workout per week, and then higher loads in the other workout? Does it matter if you divide them up or combine them?
It would not matter. I would say it matters in the sense of your personal, practical situation. The formula you set up there in a second is great. If you want to do it the other way, that's fine. It's kind of idiot proof. You can set this up however you'd like. You could actually do the inverse. Theoretically, you could do the sets of 30 first and then move to your sets of 8. It doesn't really matter because we're trying to just get to a certain total stimuli and you're going to hit it eventually. So you have a lot of room to play here. You also have a lot of room to adapt based on your circumstances. God, I'm short on time today. Typically, my workout takes me 60 minutes for this plan I have. I've only got 35 today. What do I do? If you're training for hypertrophy, you need to make sure you hit that total volume. So in this particular case, lower the load, lower the rest intervals, and just get to the burn and get going as much as you can. If you're training for strength, I would rather you cut your volume in half. Get those few repetitions done at that high load and just don't do very many sets today. That's a better result. So the goal that you're going after is going to determine what we call chaos management, which is that thing like that, running out of time today, my time is short, or I didn't even think my time was short, something got cut off, I'm not feeling it today, I'm in a hotel, et cetera, which is life, right? And that's going to be 10 to 50% of your workouts is going to be chaos management.
I'd like to ask about total workout duration, which dovetails with frequency, because if one is hitting the appropriate number of sets per week and one is combining different muscle groups on the same days, well, then workouts are going to be a very different duration than if one is doing a different body part each day, for instance. And so I feel like any discussion about frequency has to be within the context of workout duration and vice versa. Yeah.
If you are a lifting junkie and you're very consistent in your schedule, I'm actually okay with body part splits. Most people are not that. And so the concern there is if you say are isolating and waiting to do your glutes on one day of the week and something happens on that day, you might go another 13 days now before training it, between workouts. And that's really difficult to maintain. The frequency won't be high enough unless the load and volume on that one day is astronomically high. It's just not going to happen. Frequency in terms of how many days per week doesn't matter that much as long as the total load and failure are equivalent. Practically, it's a challenge. So it's hard because life gets in the way for most people. So I actually prefer doing something more like 3 days a week of total body. And if something happens, you've just missed that body part for 48 hours, 72 hours. I like that a little better for most people, not because it's more effective, but just because it's a little bit more resilient to life and you can get there. If you wanted to actually do a little bit of a combination, so if you wanted to do like 2 days a week of whole body and then 2 days a week of a little bit of a body part split, then you're actually sort of hedging against all risks there. As long as you get to that total number.
So you told us a lot about volume and frequency and how that relates to protein synthesis and recovery to evoke the hypertrophy adaptation response.
Yeah.
How should people think about systemic damage and recovery? How does one determine whether or not your entire body needs complete rest or low-level active rest or exercise of a different kind?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we actually do this in a couple of different ways. Let's start local and work back to systemic. Right? Number one, what you're really concerned about is at the local muscle level is, am I going to create excessive damage? And I don't necessarily mean muscle damage here, I mean injury. Right. So the kind of rule of thumb we use is like 3 out of 10 in terms of soreness. If you're more than 3 out of 10 in terms of soreness, we're going to start asking questions. If you're higher than 6 out of 10, we're probably not training.
This is a subjective measure.
Total subjective measure, right? And you'll know very quickly, right? If you can barely graze your pec with your fingertip, and then you're like, I don't care what you score that, we're not training. There's just no damage. If you're 3 out of 10, if you're just like, I'm kind of like a little bit stiff here, but once you get warmed up, you start feeling okay, you're probably okay to proceed there. So that is a very easy way to just think about soreness. You're going to be a little bit tight depending on your training frequency. Now, zooming out to systemic, we use a whole host of things. We can look at things like creatine kinase. That's the very common one, marker of muscle damage. We'll actually look at LDH. We'll look at myoglobulin. We'll use those biomarkers. We'll actually also look at probably a couple of things you're familiar with, ALT and AST. These are excellent biomarkers of muscle breakdown. So if we are actually suspecting that this is a chronic problem, we're going to actually go and pull some blood. If it's just like, I'm super sore today, we're going to use that subjective marker. But if we're seeing this as constant, like, man, are we really pushing you way too much? Is there some sort of systemic problem? We're going to blood, and we're going to look at all those different things. If we are more concerned with things like total training volume, systemic overload, then we may turn to something more like sleep. There's a lot of information we can actually glean from changes in sleep behavior and function. You could also look at things like HRV, heart rate variability, which is a very classic marker and much more sensitive to changes with training than something like a resting heart rate, which is one thing you can actually do that's totally cost-free. Just look at your changes and any elevation in resting heart rate over time, especially more than 3 to 5 consecutive days. Last one I would add there is simply motivation. So if you're really training hard and you like training hard and you just like cannot force yourself to go anymore, that in of itself can be a good indication of it's maybe not the day, maybe not the week. With all of these things, you want to be careful about overreacting to a single day measure. By default, generally, if hypertrophy is the goal, remember, volume is the driver there. So if I can we get in, can we go real light? Let's go to 6 out of 10 RPE, so relative perceived exertion. Maybe we'll reduce the range of motion. Maybe we'll make it a little bit easier. Maybe go to machines, or instead of going a squat, we'll just do, leg extension, something like that. But I want to still get enough volume in there. That will keep you on target. And again, even going at 50%, not to high repetition, 50% for a set of 10, 3 sets. Just get a nice blood flow in there, get it in, get it out, aid in recovery, and then move on and come back the next day. That's probably what I would do rather than canning the entire session.